You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, I have a treat for you. Rachel Cohen practices law, and boy, she drew a lot of attention when she quit her job at one of the major corporate law firms in America after it caved and cut a deal with the Trump administration. She made headlines again when she decided to, I don't know how to say this, she used TikTok to teach people how to resist ICE when they were here in the city. And that's the kind of work that she continues to do. Rachel, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we get into some specifics about what you're doing, you're really smart and you spent a lot of time studying to become a lawyer and you do legal work. So I kind of want to get your take on what's happening to law in America. And I guess I want to start with what's happening to law firms. This week, the New York Times published that investigation into the decision-making at Paul Weiss, the first big firm to cut that deal. And for those of you who don't know, Paul Weiss had a well-earned reputation as a fighter for the rights of Americans. And then it grew its M&A practice, and deciding for those pesky rights might irk some of their more profitable clients. So what do you think is going on with law firms that they're sort of less interested in law than in profits?
I think it's been a long time coming that law firms have been less interested in law than profits. And I want to put a fine point and just want to say that many articles also got this wrong. So in terms of background reading, sometimes it's difficult to figure out what's the correct order of operations. But I actually left for my law firm after Paul Weiss made the deal. And I was not employed at Paul Weiss. I worked at a different firm called Skadden Arps. And the reason that I did that was because I had been proactively organizing to try to get law firms to stand up to the Trump administration, present a united front in response to a number of executive orders he was entering that were attempting to pressure law firms out of taking on certain clients. And it was abundantly clear to me that if law firms did not stand together, that there would be a real weakening of access to counsel in the United States, despite the fact that law firms are not accessible kind of providers of counsel to the average American, that it was setting a dangerous example in terms of allowing the Trump administration to come after lawyers due to the clients and causes that they were representing. And so I left about 8 days before my own law firm, Skadden Arps, entered into a deal with the Trump administration. And I did so because it was abundantly clear to me that it was coming, not through any inside information, but based off looking at Paul Weiss's response, listening to the overwhelming silence of my own employer, and making an inference. And so I think I put a fine point on that only because something that has driven me a bit crazy is the kind of fake shock that we're seeing from many industry insiders who are surprised that people were deeply motivated by profit. Now that there are these exposés of Paul Weiss that are surprised that these were poor decisions and that law firm leaders assumed that they could out-negotiate Donald Trump because they think that they're really smart and he's really dumb, despite being outplayed by him for now the better part of a decade, because he is willing to go completely outside the rules of the game, right? And so all of that to say that we're seeing a real weakening of a norm-based institution. The law, the court system, all of these things are largely governed by people just kind of tacitly agreeing that they're going to operate a certain way. And we're seeing what happens when someone in a lot of power refuses to agree to operate that way. Here, the example would be to say that lawyers are distinct from their clients and that everyone deserves representation. But I think that that, too, is an extension of inconsistently applied norms and ideas of justice that we've seen, and particularly the criminal legal system, for a very long time, and the way that we have allowed corporations to buy the kind of representation that makes it impossible for individual consumers to ever really stand up to them because they don't have the money to go toe-to-toe. And so we're seeing the disintegration of norms and also a logical extension of what happens when you allow the law to apply unequally to people.
Well, that's frightening. Let me probe that just a little further. Kirkland, I think, began this, becoming, I want to say this properly, a company whose product is legal services, rather than a firm that practices law. It's a nuanced difference, but I think a real one. It's moving away from law as a profession to a product, and the ethos of practice to that of profit. They work differently, and they have very different outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, again, that's kind of, you've identified something that is really troubling and that I think is an extension of the fact these firms charge $3,000 an hour for top performers. These are not people that are providing legal services that are equitable or fair. For the most part, corporate law firms exist because large companies want a lot of very qualified people who are willing to work 90 hours a week to grind themselves into dust so that whoever is going up against them gets outworked because they can afford to pay for it. And a lot of the law, the practice of law at this point is just delaying, and it's not really practice whatsoever, especially in kind of these corporate spheres.
Well, but lawyers are, I think, the only profession where the code of being a lawyer requires pro bono, as opposed, I mean, it's supposedly baked into, right? Supposedly baked into the profession. And for a long time, Americans could count on these big law firms using their talent for causes where people couldn't pay. The shock that began with Paul Weiss was that they were going to turn that talent away from people who really need it and be directed by the administration about where they should put it. And that politicized pro bono entirely.
Sure. And I do want to put a fine point on kind of the nature of pro bono in the corporate legal industry, because I think that for many people, it is very much a true deep calling. I know that I spent many, many hours doing pro bono when I was a corporate attorney because it was important to me to represent migrants. But I will say that much of the kind of reputation of big law firms as particularly valuable pro bono partners is rooted in their own marketing departments. And where they tend to be the most important is where they can provide immense amounts of resources and labor. And so just to say the idea of being able to rely on big law firms generally, I think is something that I would just push back on a little bit, not because I think that it's not kind of common wisdom, but because I think that it emerges from the marketing department of firms, because these places would not do, for example, pro bono criminal defense. They would not, there were many places where they would not step into the gap out of fear that they would come into conflict with existing clients. And so just in general, I think that we're seeing, unfortunately, quite a bit of honesty about what is driving legal representation in this country. But I think you're exactly right to identify the specific escalation of like deference to the administration and almost being directed by the administration as a major, major, major escalation and one of the driving factors in my decision to resign.
Yep. We've seen a slashing. And in fact, the Republicans in Congress, I think, zeroed out legal services. So for a long time, I mean, the Supreme Court said, 50 years ago, that people were entitled to a lawyer when they're in court, and
only in criminal court. So that
in criminal
actually
court,
does not.
In criminal court, right?
But bear in mind, again, just for your listeners, that does not include, for example, people in immigration proceedings. Just relevant for the moment.
Right. Because, That's right. Yeah. That's absolutely right. But even in criminal cases, legal services has been zeroed out. Legal services covers more than criminal cases, but they zeroed it out, and that's for people who can't pay the bill. And you're right to turn to immigration. Immigration courts are not Article 3 courts. So why don't you talk to people about the problem with representation in immigration cases?
Oh, God, we only have a half an hour, so I'll try and keep it high level. But the problem with immigration court and immigration cases at this point, honestly, starts with the judges themselves, who are directly appointed by the executive branch, the Trump administration. And we saw him fire dozens and dozens of immigration judges in multiple different kind of rounds of termination, firing people who were granting asylum at high rates. And so you have immense executive control. They not only appoint and can fire all of the judges, but they also, whenever they would like to, can enter into a kind of sua sponte role where the Attorney General of the United States can issue an opinion in any immigration case they want, whenever they want. And so if a judge or the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the administrative appellate level of that court system, issues a decision that they don't like, the administration can just void it. So,
Well, of course, the Supreme Court has told us that there are no independent people in the executive branch. None.
that's certainly true.
So,
yeah.
so they just, whatever the president, if the president says no, doesn't matter what your case is, we're going to say no, you say no. That's what the Supreme Court said is what our Constitution calls for.
Yep. And that is, I think, one of those areas where I think we're really seeing the limitations of a norms-based system, because the Supreme Court, there's a norm that you don't behave that way, and there's that independence. But the immigration sphere has always been subject to more executive control, even under what I would deem much more normal and traditional executives. So
sure, because it's an Article One court, two courts.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have kind of that backdrop, and then on top of that, violations of immigration law are civil violations. And so the Supreme Court case that you referenced earlier, Gideon v. Wainwright, that guaranteed right to counsel for low-income criminal defendants, that access to counsel, that guarantee of counsel, does not extend to civil legal systems, which is also a huge issue when, for example, people are in eviction court.
Well, wait, stick with it. I just want to take one little piece of what you said, because it's so I want to say again, if you violate an immigration law, if you're here asking for asylum and you're late for court, this is a civil, not a criminal violation. So when you hear the president say all of these people are criminals because of they're violating immigration law, like what does that even mean?
It means that he lies, right? Like, you've struck on it exactly. And to be even
it's
just
like you're
to give
reading
him
my
the
mind.
mass benefit of
Rachel.
the doubt.
Yeah.
Like, even to give him the mass benefit of the doubt, if you've already been deported and re-enter, sometimes that can be a criminal offense, and it is a misdemeanor. And I find it insane. I assume you're following what's going on with U.S. Representative Max Miller. I'm following it quite closely because I am a native Ohioan. But to have Donald Trump himself with the Epstein files, with many, many violations of tax code that are criminal violations, with fraud, with many credible allegations of sexual abuse and assault against him.
Well, actual convictions, let's be clear, not just actual convictions for assault and slander and for fraud.
Yep. And so we have someone who is saying that people are criminals because they have the functional equivalent of a parking ticket, because that is what it is to be in the United States without legal documentation. It is a parking ticket.
Yeah. Okay, so you're doing stuff about this. Talk about, like, ICE was in Chicago before they went to Minneapolis, and I was very proud of my city and what we did to push them out of Chicago. And Minneapolis took the lessons we learned and improved upon them. And I'm in awe of what they did up there in the snow. But ICE is back, and they are more effective and less obvious than they were.
Yep.
Talk about what you're doing to help people learn how to protect themselves.
I want to tease out the excellent point that you just made about ICE being back and more effective than ever, because we are very much seeing that, and it does connect to the ways that I think are perhaps the most useful to get involved in terms of joining rapid response networks that are tracking the kinds of license plates that ICE is using, or the vehicles because I think that the Trump administration, every once in a while, as they are kind of pushing the boundaries of the norms-based order that I've been coming back to over and over again, every once in a while they overplay their hand. And I think that's something that we should find quite heartening, that he cannot actually just do anything and get away with it. And if people would stand up for themselves, for each other, that we would see that much less. This is back to law firms. But I think they overplayed their hand in the kind of mass invasions that we saw in Chicago and Minneapolis, because you have these blue cities in blue states where people are really, really drawing attention and standing up, and you have the visuals that look like an invasion. And so what they have done instead is two things. The first, there have been really dramatic invasions of cities in red states where the governors are enabling Donald Trump that have gotten very little national coverage. And so he's continued to do that because there hasn't been the same kind of wave of outrage and resistance that we saw from the state of Illinois and the state of Minneapolis. So, for example, in Memphis, there was a National Guardsman who shot and killed someone, I believe, like 2 weeks ago, that got almost no national coverage whatsoever, right? And then the second thing that we're seeing is exactly like you said, the kind of under-the-radar targeted enforcement operations, quote-unquote enforcement operations, targeted kidnappings of people, where ICE will basically come in to a workplace, to a home, snatch somebody, be out in 10 minutes. And that makes it very, very difficult to mobilize, whereas when you have 1,000, 3,000 ICE agents or officers in, like, military kit roaming the streets, it's pretty easy to follow those people around and make their lives harder. So I think the most effective things to be done here are to get trained on basic Know Your Rights info here in Illinois. ICER, the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights Organizations, I think.
Yes, they're fabulous.
Coalition for Immigration
And Fred is fabulous.
Rights. Yep. OCAD, which is actually run by many people who were directly impacted by the immigration system. They have these trainings, they have hotlines, and they really need people to staff them and to get kind of placed in rapid response groups. Mm-hmm. So I think that is the most immediately helpful thing. I think learning basic Spanish or brushing up on basic Spanish, particularly here in Chicago, if you are not already conversational, is really, really helpful. And I also think, and this has always been where I see my role, I think that if you're someone that has a lot of privilege, especially based in identity, if you are a white U.S. citizen, I think you need to get comfortable going not just to protests like No Kings that are permitted and that are not directly confrontational, but get comfortable going to protests at ICE facilities like in Broadview, because ultimately that kind of interruption is going to be the only thing that really indicates to the administration that what they're doing is unpopular, right? That's why they had to shift approach, was because Chicago, Minneapolis, you had people chasing ICE agents through the streets. You know?
Well, Greg Bovino was a great target. And so leaving the other part of what you're saying of showing up there matters. There's a concept amongst folks who look at dissent anywhere in the world, and it is a concept of accompanying people, right? If you're not the target, accompany someone who is. And it turns out that is a rewarding experience for you who is accompanying, but it also makes the people you're standing with stronger and gives them some more courage. And look, in Chicago, for those of you who are listening who aren't in Chicago, Little Village is a mostly Mexican neighborhood. It's where a lot of ICE focus was, but they also showed up in a neighborhood called Lincoln Park, which is a mostly white, wealthier neighborhood. And when they showed up in that neighborhood, people ran out of their houses in their bathrobes and chased ICE away. And that evening, I heard from my friends in Little Village how important it was for them to see people in this very different neighborhood standing up basically for them. And so accompanying people is a hugely important thing. And you have demonstrated that time and again, Rachel.
Thank you. And I will also say sometimes that can be really fun. Like which is something nobody really comes back to, but the idea of showing up and being with your neighbors and in community is generally joyful, but also oftentimes in Chicago especially, where people really need white allies, U.S. citizen allies to show up and show support, are these big cultural festivals that they're worried are going to be targeted by ICE agents. For example, I had someone reach out to me about like a Latin music festival on Navy Pier. I think this coming weekend or next weekend. There's Sonido in Pilsen next weekend. And one of the asks for rapid responders and allies is literally to just go to these festivals and be present and be alert and able to kind of warn people if you see agents and interrupt and give people time to get away if they need, right?
And document.
and you witness. To go to a festival and document. Exactly.
That's fabulous. Before we run out of time, I want to ask you about your home state, Ohio. What's going on there with the Haitian migrants who are there? A year ago, we had the vice president say they're eating their neighbors' cats and dogs. He later admitted he was lying, but said, you know what, the lie made people think. Well, what they make honest people think is that he's an but nonetheless, this kind of naked racism is part of what we're dealing with here. And now I understand in Ohio, they are systematically attaching leg monitors to the Haitian migrants so they can properly process them in an orderly way to prisons and then out of the country. And at the same time, although they're not yet related, but at the same time, we hear that the administration is buying decommissioned prisons around the country because they've been stopped from opening their mega mall jails. What is happening in Ohio, and how do we tell people this story in a way that resonate, that people will understand the inhumanity of it?
What's happening in Ohio is an extension of something that we've seen across the country, which is Donald Trump taking people who have legal status in this country, changing the rules because of the amount of executive authority exists in the immigration system, and making it so that these people no longer have legal status, despite the fact that they have been fully in compliance throughout their time in the United States. So many, many people from Haiti in Ohio were there on a legal status called temporary protected status, which exists for people who are in the United States fleeing some kind of disaster in their home country. Sometimes it's a war, most of the time it's a natural disaster. And so people who have entered the United States from Haiti following the earthquake in, I believe, 2021, I know there's been a couple, I don't remember when TPS started for them exactly, people were allowed to stay, to work in this country. There was no pathway to permanent legal status based on this TPS status, but there was an ability to work and to kind of build a life. And Donald Trump's administration has been withdrawing TPS for every country that has come up for a potential TPS renewal. All of those countries have been countries that are predominantly non-white. The only country that has TPS designation that is predominantly white is Ukraine, and their renewal has not come back up. And so we'll see what happens there. But that kind of making people illegal, or making people's status no longer legal while they have been in compliance consistently, and then using that to say that they are deporting people who are here illegally, is a sleight of hand that is really, really scary to many people who are even here on green cards or who are naturalized citizens, and it's understandable why. And so this kind of abuse of the legal system and also of racism, and I do have to give two quick shout outs. The first to my friend John Russell at More Perfect Union, who just won an Emmy for going to Springfield interviewing the people who initially reported the missing cat that led to J.D. Vance making the comment that you referenced earlier, and then getting on camera the cat walking across the room and saying, "Is that the cat?" And they said yes. So cat's just there. We always knew that people were not eating cats and dogs, but literally there's journalists on the ground like picking up the cat and showing it to people, and you still have people repeating these like racist narratives and lies and tropes. And the second to our own kind of Haymarket Books here in Chicago, which just put out last month a book called How to Close a Camp that outlines many, many routes to effective protests at especially the municipal level to slow the opening of additional detention facilities and camps to hold people in this country, which I think is incredibly urgent.
Yeah, and you can do this. And while this is what you're talking about was focused here in Chicago, it's going on all over the country. So wherever you are listening to this, you can actually stop, and people have stopped the administration from building its internal gulag.
Yep, absolutely. And preventing the opening of new camps is usually a bit easier than getting an existing one closed, but obviously we've got to focus on both.
Yeah.
Yep.
Rachel, I think yesterday, or maybe not yesterday, but sometime this week, Donald Trump signed 2 new executive orders trying once again to eliminate parts of birthright citizenship. Your friends at the Supreme Court, by only 5-4, can read the words that if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, and only 5 of 9 judges could read that and understand what it means. So he's at it again. Why does it why do you think it matters, birthright citizenship? And what happens in a country if the president can just take away people's citizenship?
Birthright citizenship matters both practically as a kind of foundational, and we have something called reliance interests, right? When we're talking about contracts, for example, where people make plans based on expecting things to happen a certain way because that's what was promised to them. And you can't just change that up, right? But I think the consistency and the meeting expectations is a very important reason. But then I think that there's a much more important symbolic reason, and I think that Ketanji Brown Jackson, as she always does when she dissents, did an excellent job driving this point home in her dissent. Birthright citizenship in this country exists because we had to ensure that people who had been enslaved in this country had citizenship, because that was a legal gray area. People that had been trafficked to this country were not officially citizens. And so the update of this language in the Constitution was necessary to make sure that people had access to, at least we're supposed to have access to, the full rights of citizenship in this country. And that is
it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing. I lived in parts of the world where I worked in parts of the world for a long time where there was no birthright citizenship, and the king or the emir could make somebody a citizen, but could also take those rights away if they didn't like what they were doing. And to say all the rights of being an American can be stripped away because of somebody's politics means the people are no longer free.
Politics, and once again, the repetition of race-based discrimination in this way, because that is exactly who Donald Trump is targeting with the rollback of birthright citizenship, despite the fact that, of course, this also has major implications for people of all races and backgrounds.
You mean like his wife?
Including his wife with kind of her visa status, many other people. I saw this terrible article about how someone in the administration basically called ICE on a friend's ex-wife in order
Yes,
to
yes,
bully her in like a
yes.
custody battle.
Yep.
This is a nation, often to our a bit of shame, frankly. This is a nation of immigrants. We are, unless you are indigenous to this land, you came here from somewhere else. And I think it is morally abhorrent. If we want to claim that moniker, that should still come with real reflection on settler dynamics in this country. But to claim that and then to strip access to citizenship away from people
Appalling.
while you yourself are not native to the land is appalling.
Well, that is, we've run out of time, Rachel, so that's got to be our last word. But I really appreciated this conversation and your work. If people just want to follow the work that you do, how do they do it?
I am generally available on social media at Cohen, Cohen .489, and I'm also on Substack with occasional essays at Cohen489.substack.com. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate the conversation.